Imagine you're asked a question at a meeting, or perhaps in a job interview, or you're asked at an event to come up and say a few words. How does it go? Do you ever freeze up, not know what to say, or ramble on endlessly, hoping you'll eventually find a point to make? Well, that happens to me too, less now than it used to. And I still remember the very first time that I was caught off guard. It was in high school English class. We were studying Romeo and Juliet, and the English teacher was droning on and on about some arcane point in the story, and I drifted off. Been there, kind of not paid attention in class, until he said, "Diane, what do you think?" Oh, that got my attention. My stomach went in knots, my face turned red, and I managed to say, could you repeat the question? And he gave me one of those teachers look like, really? Yeah, I wasn't listening, but he was kind enough to repeat the question. But I was so flustered that I couldn't come up with an answer, as 30 pair of eyeballs were staring at me, some with pity, some with relief that they weren't in my spot, and a few with superiority because they had an answer. Well, I did get a little better at answering questions like that when I became an engineer. And I had a new approach to answering questions. I would build the logical case step by step toward my point. The only problem was that it frustrated people. One time my boss even said, "Won't you just get to the point?" Later, I joined Toastmasters, a worldwide organization that helps people improve their communication and leadership skills. And in a typical meeting, there's a section called Table Topics, or Impromptu Speaking Practice, where there is a topic master who will ask a member a question that they haven't prepared for, and you get 1 to 2 minutes to answer the question. Well, the first couple of times, I think I got maybe 15 seconds in and just couldn't wait to sit down. Over the years, I did get a little bit better at answering questions through more exposure in Toastmasters, business networking events. I even took a couple of improv classes. In fact, about 10 years ago, I even became a presentation coach and worked with people primarily on prepared presentations. But in the past couple of years, so many people have approached me about impromptu speaking skills, whether it be in meetings, in job interviews, or even in conflict situations, that I developed an online course, started a coaching program, and am currently writing a book and even doing this particular presentation today. The Impromptu Workshop. And I'm, by the way, Diane Windingland, virtual speech coach. I originally gave this workshop as an interactive workshop, but I decided to record myself going through it because of popular demand to have a replay of the workshop. So now, again, there are a lot of situations that you could use impromptu speaking in. Meetings, question and answer sessions, job interviews, conflict communications, and many, many more. So many common everyday situations that you can use impromptu speaking. But sometimes you may be called to speak from the heart and to make a difference. Will you be ready to make a difference? Just the way Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did in 1963 when he had a carefully planned speech and he was speaking in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Then all of a sudden he went off script and he said, "I still have a dream." He set his notes aside and went on to give that portion of the speech celebrated by history as the "I have a dream" speech. Now, he was familiar with the concept. He'd used those words before, but never in this unplanned kind of situation. It was the perfect fusion of when preparedness and opportunity come together? Will you be ready to make a difference when you have an opportunity? You can be ready if you are strategic. You can buy time as one strategy, give yourself some time to think. You can use frameworks so you have a structure for an impromptu response. You can even resolve and deal with communication during conflict. And I'll show you one way to do that, a framework. And of course, you can appear more confident as you are giving a response. Now, you might be thinking, whoa, that is a lot to keep track of. I want to let you know that in the description of this video, I am going to have a link to some resources, which will include an infographic on impromptu speaking with the 11 ways to buy time, the 9 impromptu frameworks, plus a couple of more freebies. The link will be at the end and in the description. I also have a book coming soon, probably within a couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for that as well. But let's move on to that first strategy, buy time. Sometimes you just need a little more time to gather your thoughts, to grasp a concept, to clarify the question even. I'm quickly going to go over 11 ways to buy time on this slide, and then I will go into a little more depth on each one. Way number 1, pause for breath. Repeat or rephrase the question. Clarify the question. Ask a question about the question. You can also talk about the question or answer part of the question. You can acknowledge the question and pivot to something that is perhaps more important. You can repeat your own or someone else's words. You can review, take a step back and summarize. You can ask for time to think about it or to get more information. You can take a sip of water or even sometimes turn it over to someone else. So let's look at the first few. Pause for a breath. A 3 to 5 second pause where you take a breath as well, maybe not that noisy, will give you time to think. It will also provide oxygen to your brain to help you think even more clearly. And if you do it in a deliberate way, it can make you look even more confident that you're considering the question before you're jumping in. You can repeat or rephrase the question. By repeating or rephrasing the question, not only do you get a little extra time, but it also makes sure that both you and the person who asked the question really do understand the question. Yes, sometimes people ask a question and they're not even clear on their own question. Now, you can listen for key words to repeat. So let's say that you are on a job interview and the interviewer asks, why do you want to work here? You could respond using some of the same key words. I would like to work here because, or, so you'd like to know why I'd like to work here. Both are ways of repeating or rephrasing. You can also clarify the question, which is asking questions about the question. Now, hopefully you won't be in a tricky job interview situation where they ask you some questions such as, what are 5 things you could do with a paperclip other than holding papers together? Now, you might respond by repeating or rephrasing the question and then clarifying the intent of the question. Maybe saying something like, what are 5 things that I could do with a paperclip? That was the rephrasing. And then you could ask, so you want some out-of-the-box ideas, right? That is clarifying the question. Now, there are many ways that you can lead into a clarifying question, and here are several. You could say, so what you're asking, what I hear you saying is, are you saying, in other words, from what I understand, you want to know, if I understood you correctly, Correct me if I'm wrong. What you're saying is you can clarify the question. Now, before we move on, I want to point out that you can combine these techniques that will buy you even more time. For example, you might take a breath, repeat or rephrase the question, and then ask a clarifying question. So think about this for a moment and take a breath and think about how you would rephrase this question. If you could have a conversation with anyone, who would it be? Breathe, repeat or rephrase. If I could have a conversation with anyone, who would it be? Now add in the clarifying step and ask a question about the question. Do you mean someone alive or dead? And then they'll respond and you have even more information that you can use to answer the question. So you can combine these techniques as well. Let's move on to the next buy time technique. Talk about the question. You can make some positive statement about the question. You don't want to say, well, that's a stupid question. You could use words like this. That's a great or fantastic or insightful or intriguing question. I'm sure a lot of people here are wondering the same thing. Or let's unpack that question, which is a useful way to approach a question that is complex. You can also answer part of the question. You might select to answer part that you have knowledge on, or you might select to answer a part of the question that is less divisive. So here's a couple of ways you could do that. There's one aspect of that question I can answer right now. Or for now, let's address and then just answer part of the question. Another technique is to acknowledge and pivot. You don't want to use this one too often, but it can be very useful. In fact, you've probably seen politicians use it all the time, where they address the question and then they move off to one of their talking points. Now, you might want to redirect a question occasionally to something that you feel is a more critical issue or one that you feel less vulnerable in answering. Here's some ways you might do that. That's an interesting question, but a more important concern is, or what I think you really want to know is, so sometimes you can acknowledge and pivot. Often you can repeat your own or another's words. If you've been taking notes during a meeting, you can come back to something you said or shine the light on someone else and repeat something they said. You'll not only look like a sharp listener, but someone who's willing to share the spotlight with others. You can also review, take a step back and summarize. For example, you might say, let me take a step back to make sure I understand everything first. Or you can even frame it as a benefit to everyone in the meeting. Let's take a step back to make sure we're all on the same page. We've covered a lot so far. You can ask for more time to think or to get information. You probably don't want to use this too often because you don't want to always say you have to get back to people, but you can buy yourself some time by saying things like, I'll need to get back to you on that so I can give you a full answer or better or complete answer, and then let them know when you can get back to them. I can get back to you tomorrow. Or you might say, I need to do some research or dig a little deeper before I can answer that. Another thing you might try is, I don't want to give you the wrong information. So let me check with someone's name, someone's department, and get back with you. So try this when you need a little more time to think or get information. You can also take a sip of water. It's a good idea to have something to sip on during a meeting. You not only can quench your thirst, but you can use it as a way to buy a little time where you might extend your pause by taking a drink. You can sip slowly and look thoughtfully as you are composing your answer. So take a sip of water. I always have some water handy. Finally, you can turn it over to someone else. Sometimes you aren't the best person to answer a question, or you might want to shine the light on another team member. You can ask them to provide input. Ideally, you'll say a few words around whatever the question is before you turn it over. You might say something like, our project leader, Sue, has been working on that very issue. Sue, what are your thoughts? Now, occasionally, don't overdo this, you can turn the question back on the questioner. That's a great question. What are some of your thoughts on the matter? Now, again, you can combine some of these techniques. You can take a breath, repeat or rephrase the question, and then use one or more other delay tactics to help you formulate that answer. So those are some ideas that you can use to buy yourself some time. Strategy number 2, use impromptu frameworks. Responding clearly and confidently when you're called on unexpectedly is easier if you have a pre-planned framework. Now, sometimes you're asked a question and there are many directions you could go, or maybe there's many things that come to your mind. For example, let's say someone asks me, what's your favorite food? Well, I like a lot of different foods, so I might even address that one. I like so many different foods. I don't know if I have a favorite, but then so I can answer the question, I'll just pick one. One of my favorite foods is Brussels sprouts. And then I maybe will talk a little bit more about that. Whatever framework you use, remember to keep it relevant. Remember why they would care and frame your answer in a way that is of interest to the person you're talking with. Rather like this cartoon. You might have a lot of things you want to say. They have things they're interested in, but there's only a little bit of what you want to say that they're interested in, and that's where you can stay relevant. So I'm quickly going to go through 9 impromptu frameworks, just touching on them, and you can get the details in that infographic or my upcoming book as well. And I'll go a little bit deeper into 2 of them. The first technique is prep. That is when you get to the point. You would state your point, give a reason, give an example, and restate your point. Then there's a way to get buy-in by talking about the what, the why, and the how in order to get the buy-in. You might answer like a journalist, the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, and why in your answer. You might, if there's a problem and you know the cause and you have a suggested solution, well, you've got your framework, problem, cause, solution. Sometimes you're asked to make a recommendation. You could state the pros and the cons and then make a recommendation. You sometimes want to cast a vision for the future or take them on a journey. You can talk about the past, the present, the future for a particular issue. Often you want to frame your response with multiple perspectives. For example, if you're talking about some issue at your organization, you might say, let's look at this from the perspectives of both the company and the customer. So consider other perspectives. A very common interview situation is the behavioral interview question. And we'll go into that in a little bit more depth later. And a technique for answering that is STAR, where you talk about the situation, the task you had, the action you took, and the result of that action. Finally, sometimes you want to use a story to tell a lesson. You have a point, you tell a story, and from that story, there was a lesson that was learned. So that's a lot of approaches in a very short time. Let's look at 2 of them just a little more closely, prep and STAR. Prep is getting to the point. And it's an acronym where the first P stands for state your point. The R is to give a reason. E is to state an example. And the final P is to restate your point. This is a great approach to use, especially when talking with upper level executives who are in a rush and they want you to get to the point, not build up to the point like I did when I was a young engineer. I'll give you a non-business example. Let's say you and I were talking about an upcoming vacation or some vacation ideas. My point might be, I suggest you consider taking a cruise because, that's a clue, I'm going to give you a reason, because cruises are so relaxing and convenient. For example, a little bit before the pandemic, my husband and I took a 22-day, 18-port cruise. And that was a lot of place to see in 20 days, but fortunately, we did not have to make 18 separate accommodations or lug our luggage from place to place, or even worry where we were going to eat every meal. That was all on the ship. So if you want a convenient and relaxing vacation, I suggest you consider taking a cruise. Now, if you want to try it, in a little bit, you can pause the video and try it yourself, maybe by yourself or with another person. And you can think of a vacation destination, a restaurant, or a product or service where you can state your point, give a reason, give an example, and restate your point. Moving on to STAR. STAR is something that's used in often interview situations when you're asked to respond to a prompt, such as, can you give me an example of how you handle tasks when your project is on a tight deadline? These questions are called behavioral interview questions, and they're meant to assess how you deal with those questions, your skill, and your professionalism. They're questions about how you acted in a specific instance. And this again is an acronym. The S stands for situation, the T stands for task, the A is for action, and the R is for result. So the situation is when you'd start with a little bit of the context, the who, what, when, where, why, whatever. And the task is what your job was, what you were responsible for in the situation. The action is the action you or your team took if you were leading a team, and the result is the outcome. Now, if the outcome was not a positive outcome, you can always use something that you learned from that particular situation. So, for example, if you're asked, can you give me an example of how you handle tasks when your project is on a tight deadline? You might respond something like this. Situation. Every project is slightly different, but most are on a tight deadline. At my current job, part of my responsibilities were to create protocols, testing protocols. I was on a team with 3 people, and we had to create 9 protocols in 2 weeks. It was an ambitious schedule, and unfortunately, a few days in, one of the team members became ill, and she was going to be out of commission probably for at least a week. Here's the task part. My manager then split the extra work between the 2 of us that remained, and my workload increased by probably 50%. And it seemed like we couldn't hire anybody else, and there was just too much to do. So after discussing this situation with my teammate, I asked our manager if we could have a reduction in time in our other tasks so we could focus on this particular task, and she agreed. So we doubled our efforts, and thanks to our being proactive, we finished the protocols 2 days early. The team member who was ill came back. We even got to go over it with her, and we submitted them a day before the deadline. My manager noted the extra effort. I got a promotion, and it went very well. So anyway, so that's just sort of an example is using STAR in an interview situation. So if you'd like to try it out in just a moment, I will give you some scenarios that you could pause the video and try. Tell me about a time you had to deal with conflict on the job. Give me an example of a time that you felt you went above and beyond your call of duty at work. What is your greatest failure and what did you learn from it? All right, moving on to strategy number 3, dealing with conflict in the moment. One of the most challenging types of impromptu speaking is when you're dealing with unanticipated conflict or criticism. There's a lot of ways that people deal with that. Some fly away, some freeze, some get aggressive, they fight. Usually the best way to handle work situations is to face the conflict and find a way to collaborate. Because most conflict is a matter of perspective, we want to do things that will help us see someone else's perspective. I recall a story that I read probably two decades ago from Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, called The Man on the Train. And it was a story in which Stephen Covey was on a subway train on a Sunday morning. It was very relaxing. People were reading the paper, having coffee. And then a man and 2 young children entered the subway, and the man sat right down next to Stephen Covey, closed his eyes, and did not notice that his children were making a ruckus. They were running around, tearing papers out of people's hands, being noisy. And Stephen Covey couldn't believe that this guy was doing nothing. So after what he thought was, high patience on his part, he finally turned to the guy and said, "Sir, your children are disturbing people. I wonder if you couldn't control them a little more." And the man looked at Stephen Covey and said, "Oh, you're right. I guess I should do something about it. We just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago, and I don't know what to think. And I guess they don't know how to handle it either." Suddenly, Stephen Covey saw things different. Because he saw differently, he felt differently, and he behaved differently, and asked the man, "Your wife just died? I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do to help?" So realize that when you're in conflict, it's usually a matter of perspective. And one way you can de-escalate that conflict communication is by a technique that I read about a long time ago called LEAP, which is another acronym, which stands for listen reflectively. You pay attention, don't just wait for your turn to talk. Empathize, let them know you know how they feel. Agree, find something to agree on, maybe even if it's just agreeing on values or the big picture. And then partner together. It's not you versus me, it's we versus the problem. Shortly after I first read about this, I had a situation I could apply it in. I was homeschooling my 15-year-old son at the time. He was 15, and it was not going well. He would be asleep during the day and awake at night. And I felt like he was not making progress toward his schoolwork. And I had been ragging on him about this, and he just wasn't even responding. So one day, after reading about LEAP, I decided to try it. I went up to my son and I said, "Sean, you are asleep most of the day and awake at night. Why is that?" And he looked at me and said, "So I don't have to be around you." Ouch. Well, rather than break out defensively at him or get aggressive, I took a breath and I said, "Tell me more about that." And he went on to tell me that he thought I was overbearing and controlling and all things that were hard to hear. And again, I tried not to be defensive, but instead I tried to empathize. And I said, "Sean, if I were you, I would probably feel the same way and not want to be around me." And a tear came to his eye. I had gotten through to him. And we were able to continue on with the conversation where we could agree on some big picture things and talk about how we could work together to have a mutually beneficial solution. So if you're facing conflict communication, try leaping into it. And remember, it can be a matter of perspective and to partner together, because it's not you versus me, it's we versus the problem. All right, the final strategy: convey confidence with your voice and body language. There are a lot of ways that you can convey confidence. In fact, I have a book that I wrote a couple of years ago, 100 Tips and Tricks to Appear Confident in Presentations. I'm just going to touch on 3 of those ideas, 2 with your voice and 1 with your body language. The first one is to slow down, because most people speed up when they're nervous, which can exacerbate their nervousness, and it can cause their heart rate and breathing to increase, which will make them feel even more nervous and less able to come up with something semi-intelligent to say. So instead, take that breath, rephrase the question, and slow down. Pause between thoughts or at the end of important statements, and you will come across as calm and confident. You may have even noticed that some of the upper level executives tend to talk more slowly. So you can look like you are calm and confident if you do slow down a little bit from time to time. If saying or ah or having filler words such as like or is a challenge for you, you can work on those too. Now, a few are no big deal, but if you have too many, it can negatively affect your credibility. A few years ago, a company hired me to work with a senior lighting technician named Michael, who was going to be speaking at a conference in just a couple of weeks. And they were concerned that he would embarrass the company, in part because he said so many ums. So I decided to tackle that when we got together as the first issue of business. I had him give the first 3 minutes of his presentation. I recorded it on my iPad, and then I played it back to him. And after he watched it, he turned to me and said, "That was awful." And I said, "So you would like to decrease your ums?" And he said, "Definitely." So I said, "Okay, you're not going to like this, but it will help." And what I did is I took my can of Coke that I had at the time and a pen and said, "You're going to do your 3-minute intro again. And every time you say, I'm going to hit this can. And instead of me hitting the can, you can avoid it if you are just silent." So I forgot to mention, the first time he did it, he had 30 ums. And then the second time he started to do the same amount of ums, and I was hitting the can, it kind of threw him off of his game, and he started to just be silent. And then I had him do his introduction a third time. I set the can aside, I videoed him, and the third time he only had 3 ums in those 3 minutes, a vast reduction. So ways that you can work on filler words is, first of all, gain awareness. Record yourself in a conversation or at a meeting and just see if it is an excessive amount. You can just also practice silence. Just catch yourself and be silent. And pretty soon your fluency will increase and you will not feel like it's so awkward. You can also enlist help to improve faster. Maybe you'll have a family member. For some of the people I coach with that have a big concern about it, I will even use this little sound box where if they want to work on it, otherwise I don't work on it with them. When they say, I'll just make this little tone to give them that awareness. Another technique is to pause and make eye contact. I can still hear my mother when I was 6 years old saying, "Look at me when I'm talking to you," because my mother knew that making eye contact when communicating with people was important. It let them know that you were being honest, that you had a fair level of confidence, and that you were paying attention. So pause and make eye contact when you are answering the question. If it's in a room, address the person with your eyes whom asked the question, and you can look around at other people and then come back to that person at the end of your answer. So I would say typically about 3 to 5 seconds is a good amount of time to make eye contact. If you need to look away because you don't want to be overbearing with it. But the tricky thing nowadays is when you are speaking online. So when you're speaking, you primarily should look into the webcam while you're speaking, which isn't exactly eye contact, because right now I'm looking into the lens of the camera. You feel like I'm making eye contact with you. If I had a gallery of people on the screen and I was looking at their eyes, none of them would feel like I was making eye contact with them until I look directly into the camera lens. So look into the webcam when you're speaking. I've gone through a lot of strategies in the short time for buying time, 11 ways. Using frameworks, I quickly went over 9 and went through 2 of them in a little more depth. Resolving conflict, leaping into conflict, and a few techniques for appearing confident. So I have to ask you, do you feel just a little bit better prepared to make a difference in your life, in your work? I hope so. Now, the free stuff that'll be in the link below this video in the description will be a link that includes the infographic that I mentioned with the ways to buy time and the frameworks. There will be a free online impromptu speaking course. Then I also am including a complimentary communication consult. If you want to practice something with an interview or impromptu practice, or even discuss some coaching programs with me. Of course, if you want to hold up your phone, I have a QR code right there, or just click the link in the description. I hope that you will have great impromptu speaking opportunities.